If you belong to a Muslim family or Islamic background, you would have surely heard stories of jinns from your elders or your friends. According to Islam, jinns are of two types, good ones and the evil ones. This story was shared by a person named TARIQ, who was living in America and he had to visit Middle East for some study purpose. The incident happened when he was in Mauritania. The writer describes that it was time of sunset and everywhere around him was pitch darkness. It was like a pitch black blanket covered everything that should have been in sight. He writes that I settled onto the sleeping bag strewn across the floor of the enormous foreign students' ambar or say house tent. While at times this ambar housed as many as 7 people. Now no other student were here, I was alone. My sleep came in fits and bursts. Exhaustion battled the uncomfortableness of sleeping on a concrete floor. I was asleep 1 minute, awake the next, and then asleep again. Suddenly my eyes snapped open in the darkness. I saw a man standing in the corner, leaning on the back wall as if he were waiting for me. I couldn't make out his exact figure except that he was skinny, with a turban and a thin beard. I briefly considered whether I was still asleep, but no, I was definitely awake. This figure, he seemed to notice I was looking big because he acknowledged my stare with a curt nod and immediately began walking over. I couldn't move. I was too paralyzed by fear to do anything more than just lay there and watch as he came closer and closer. Then as soon as he reached the edge of my sleeping bag, he passed right around and straight out the tent. This was ridiculous. I had been warned that the Mauritanian villagers don't have much of a sense of privacy and walk into your tent without asking. But this to barge into my tent in the middle of the night, then stroll out without saying a word. No sir, this was too much. I grabbed the flashlight beside me, beamed it onto the man just as he was leaving and hot on his tail. Ran out to confront him. This creepster would not get away with his intrusion. As I went outside, I swung around my light, searching for the direction he went to. Left, right, straight ahead. Again and again I swung my light around and around, but there was no one there. No man, not even a trace. Confused and still exhausted, I went back to sleep mumbling the Ayatul Kursi. Ayatul Kursi is an ayat mentioned in Quran which protects us from evil. The next day was a blur of studying, reading, eating and daydreaming about a sweet cold can of Coca-Cola that would never come. And before I knew it, the sun was setting once again. This time as night inched closer, it brought with it a feeling of extreme dread. I thought of confiding in someone about what I had seen the night before, but the Mauritanians had already deemed me not enough of a man. And I wasn't going to ruin my image further by running over and crying about Jinn. So I tried the only other strategy I could think of, stay awake the whole night. Needless to say, the strategy didn't work. Again, exhaustion from the extreme heat overcame me and I laid down to sleep. Again, my sleep was restless. 1 minute I was awake, the next minute dreaming a terrible dream. And then awake again. Towering over me, I could make out the figure of someone I knew and disliked very much. But the situation didn't make any sense. This person I so disliked was supposed to be halfway across the world in America. But here they were standing over my head in a tiny remote village in Mauritania. I stared up in shock. He glowered down at me. I grabbed my book light from beside me and shined it on his face, hoping it would repel him. It didn't. Unfazed, he continued staring down a menacing stare. I leapt up from my sleeping bag, stumbling backwards. I turned my light on him, ready for whatever confrontation was necessary. If he pursued me to this middle of nowhere village at this ungodly hour, then I couldn't just let him go. But there was no confrontation. Whoever was standing right over me 1 second ago had vanished into thin air. More frightened than I would ever be in my life, I looked longingly in the direction of Murabit's house, where I had stayed first night in Tuemarat. It would be so much more comfortable to stay there, sleeping close to the Sheikh and his family. Surely no jinn would dare to come there, but I held back. I must not seem to be like a scaredy cat. I told myself I must not seem afraid. Now a month or two had passed without any more visits from these apparitions. Even so, I remembered a little scared and always on edge. The Mauritanians continued to frighten me with various stories of jinns. They said, for instance, one lonely night a student had been sitting at the cell phone spot, about a mile away from the village, casually browsing his phone. When he felt a pebble thrown at him, he ignored it, probably another villager playing a prank. He thought that. Then, as he continued browsing, he felt someone sat beside him. He glanced up from his phone. Beside him was a strange man with a horribly distorted and ugly face, grinning widely. The stranger had never before been seen around these parts, and he was never seen again. The story was probably more fiction than fact, but it was more than enough to frighten me. Every time I walked off alone to the cell phone spots around 3 am and heard a wolf howling, the wind whooshing, or a stone dropping down the mountain, my heart nearly jumped out of my chest. One afternoon I was flickering through a book titled Purification of the Heart, where I happened upon a chapter about fear that changed my perspective forever. Fear of anything besides God is from a weakness of faith. I thought back to the incredible fear I had of the Jinns here and realized my sense of fear did indeed stem from a weakness of faith. Only 2 weeks remained now till I returned to America. My back had become used to the concrete floor and my eyes to the darkness that enveloped everything. For months now I had never seen or heard anything out of the ordinary. Until when one middle of the night I gradually awoke. From behind me I could hear the sound of pouring water. It was almost as if someone had opened the giant carton of water I stored in my ambar, tilted it over ever so slightly, and was filling their jug slowly. Someone had come into my tent this late at night and is pouring out my water? Impossible. It must be a cow urinating just outside, as they so often did. Or surely I must be hallucinating. 10 seconds passed, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. Cow do not urinate this long. 1 minute. I was definitely wide awake and not hallucinating now. I could clearly make out that the sound of pouring water came from only 2 or 3 feet behind me, precisely where I had left my giant carton of water before going to bed. At that very moment I was almost certain that had I turned around I would have seen a figure standing right behind me pouring out the water. But I didn't turn around, there was no need. Instead I smiled and thought back to the chapter I had read. Fear of anything besides God is from a weakness of faith. It was almost like God was testing me. I laughed, settled back into bed, and slept like a baby. The man who fears nothing but God has nothing but God to fear.